What if I told you that the fate of World War II hung in the balance in the freezing outskirts of Moscow in 1941? This was no ordinary battle, it was a clash where the sheer will of the Soviet forces met the blitzkrieg advancements of Nazi Germany head-on. The Battle of Moscow marked a crucial pivot point, potentially altering the course of the entire war. It was here that the unyielding cold played as much a role as the soldiers themselves. Join me as we step back to the early 1940s, where the world watched in suspense. As 1941 dawned, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. In a display of military might that shocked the world, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, aiming nothing less than the complete conquest of the Soviet Union. This marked the largest military operation in human history, both in manpower and casualties. The German war machine rolled eastward with terrifying efficiency. Spearheaded by panzer divisions, the Wehrmacht swiftly overran the Soviet defenses, utilizing blitzkrieg tactics that had proven devastatingly effective in Western Europe. Cities fell like dominoes. Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev were captured, each victory bringing the Germans closer to the heart of Soviet power, Moscow. By autumn, the German forces were at the very gates of Moscow, just a few miles from the Kremlin. The rapid advancements were not just a testament to German military prowess, but also highlighted the initial unpreparedness and strategic miscalculations of the Soviet leadership. Stalin's purges had decimated the ranks of experienced Red Army officers, leaving the Soviet military struggling to mount a coherent defense in the early stages of the invasion. However, as the German troops prepared for the final assault on Moscow, they faced a new, formidable enemy, the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted, and the once rapid German advance slowed to a crawl under the extreme cold and snow. Mechanical failures became commonplace as tanks and trucks froze. But as the Wehrmacht approached Moscow, the harsh Russian winter began to set in, setting the stage for a grueling conflict. Staring down the barrel of defeat, the Soviet Union was not ready to give in. As the German army inched closer to Moscow in the autumn of 1941, the urgency within the Soviet leadership reached a fever pitch. The looming threat of invasion demanded extraordinary measures, and Joseph Stalin, along with his generals, orchestrated a series of strategic maneuvers that would define the resilience of a besieged nation. The first of these strategies was the controversial yet effective scorched earth policy. As the Wehrmacht advanced, Soviet forces were ordered to adopt a burn-and-destroy approach. They demolished infrastructure, burned crops, and destroyed anything that could possibly aid the German advance. This ruthless tactic aimed to leave nothing but ashes for the enemy, severely complicating their logistics and slowing their progress. In tandem with these destructive efforts, a massive mobilization took place. Stalin called upon reserves from every corner of the vast Soviet Union. Men and women from as far as Siberia were summoned to defend the motherland. This rapid mobilization was a testament to the Soviet capacity to rally in the face of existential threats. Factories were also repurposed almost overnight, with workers switching from peacetime productions to manufacturing tanks, guns, and ammunition. The Soviet war machine was waking up. Central to the Soviet defense was General Georgy Zhukov, a name that would soon echo through the annals of military history. Zhukov was a master strategist and a decisive leader who understood the stakes. He reorganized the Soviet defenses around Moscow, fortifying positions and setting up multiple lines of defense. His ability to inspire and command respect was pivotal. Under his leadership, fresh troops and civilian volunteers worked tirelessly, digging trenches and building fortifications around Moscow. As winter approached, the Soviet strategy began to show its efficacy. The harsh weather, combined with the scorched earth policy, began to take a toll on the German troops, unprepared for the brutal Russian winter. The stage was set for a desperate defense, but the Soviet Union, under the stern gaze of leaders like Stalin and Zhukov, was determined not to falter. With their backs against the wall, the Soviet forces prepared to defend their capital at all costs. In October 1941, the first snow fell, and with it began one of the most significant battles of the Second World War. As the German forces advanced towards Moscow, the temperature plunged, and the landscape transformed into a harsh, white battleground. The German Operation Typhoon aimed to capture the Soviet capital, believed to be the key to knocking the Soviet Union out of the war. The Wehrmacht, having pushed deep into Soviet territory, now faced the fortified Mozhaisk defense line, a series of strong points stretching across the approaches to Moscow. The Soviet response was a desperate yet strategic blend of counterattacks and staunch defenses. General Zhukov, tasked with the defense of Moscow, managed to scrape together fresh reserves, pulling in troops from the Siberian and Far Eastern military districts, forces that were acclimatized to the severe winter conditions. This reinforcement provided a much-needed boost to the beleaguered Soviet defenders. October and November saw a series of brutal confrontations around Volokholamsk, Tula, and Klin. The fighting was intense and unforgiving, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Germans, initially confident, found themselves bogged down, their supply lines overstretched, and their equipment failing in the freezing temperatures. The vaunted German blitzkrieg, so effective in the warmer months, lost its momentum in the face of general winter. The Russian winter proved to be an unrelenting foe for the Germans. Tanks and guns jammed, and frostbite claimed as many soldiers as combat. The image of German soldiers, unprepared for temperatures dropping below -30 degrees Celsius, struggling to operate their frozen machinery, starkly highlighted the inadequacies in their winter preparations. As December rolled in, the Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive. Utilizing the weakened state of the German troops, they began pushing the invaders back from the outskirts of Moscow. The resilience and tenacity of the Soviet soldiers, combined with the harsh winter conditions, effectively blunted the German offensive. As the new year dawned, the tide began to turn in favor of the Red Army. By January 1942, the German advance had not only stalled but was being pushed back. The bitter cold of the Russian winter had set in, gripping the once unstoppable Wehrmacht in its icy grasp. Amidst this frozen landscape, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive that would forever alter the course of the Second World War. In early December 1941, as temperatures plunged and snow blanketed the battlefield, Soviet forces initiated a series of counterattacks. This strategic move came at a time when German troops were at their most vulnerable, exhausted by months of fighting and ill-prepared for the harsh winter conditions. The Germans, who had advanced with the belief that Moscow would be quickly seized, found themselves woefully unequipped for winter warfare. The Soviet counteroffensive was not merely a battle, it was a statement. Under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, the Red Army began to encircle and push back the German forces from the outskirts of Moscow. This marked the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht in the war, a crucial turning point that shattered the myth of their invincibility. The impact of this Soviet victory was profound. It boosted the morale of the Red Army and the Soviet people, proving that the Nazi war machine could be stopped and defeated. It also forced the Germans to reconsider their strategies and acknowledge the resilience and strength of the Soviet forces. The Battle of Moscow not only halted the Nazi advance, but also marked the beginning of a long, grueling fight back for the Soviets. The echoes of the Battle of Moscow resonate as a testament to resilience and strategic ingenuity. As the last German units retreated from the outskirts of Moscow in early 1942, the immediate aftermath was palpable. The Soviet capital, though battered, stood unbroken, a symbol of defiance and enduring spirit. The German Wehrmacht, which had been seemingly invincible up until this point, faced its first major defeat. This not only halted their advance, but also marked the beginning of a long, grueling attrition war on the Eastern Front. The repercussions were immediate and profound. German military strategy, which had relied heavily on swift, decisive victories, had to be reconsidered. Hitler's directive for a quick defeat of the Soviet Union before winter had faltered, and with it, the myth of Nazi invincibility began to crumble. On the Soviet side, the successful defense of Moscow galvanized the Red Army and the Soviet people. The victory provided a significant boost to morale and proved to be a pivotal turning point in Soviet military fortunes. It demonstrated the effectiveness of the Soviet command under extreme pressure, and the ability of its troops to rally and turn the tide against a formidable enemy. This battle also marked the emergence of General Zhukov, who would go on to become one of the most respected military leaders in Soviet history. Strategically, the Battle of Moscow forced the Axis powers to overextend their lines, draining their resources and manpower, which were already stretched thin across multiple fronts. This shift allowed the Soviets to begin planning counteroffensives, which would eventually see them push westward across Eastern Europe. The psychological impact of the battle cannot be overstated. For the Allies, Moscow's stand was a beacon of hope. It was clear proof that the Axis powers were not unbeatable. This had implications for strategic planning and alliances in the years that followed, influencing decisions in both European and Pacific theaters. Thus, the Battle of Moscow stands not just as a siege but as a turning point that helped shape the outcome of World War II. So, what can we learn from the Battle of Moscow? This pivotal confrontation not only halted the advance of one of the most formidable military forces in history, but also marked a significant turning point in World War II. It showcased the resilience and strategic acumen of the Soviet forces under extreme pressure. The fierce defense of Moscow rejuvenated Soviet morale and stymied the Axis powers' momentum, ultimately influencing the broader outcome of the war. In the darkest hours of 1941, the Battle of Moscow proved that the will to survive could change the course of history.